Call the roll.
Representative Kelly.
Here.
Representative Jenkins Arno. Here. Representative Markkinen.
Here.
Representative Beeson. Representative Borton.
Here.
Representative Glanville.
Present.
Representative Steckloff.
Present.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. House Appropriations Subcommittee on School Aid and Department of Education will follow the uniform committee rules stated in Chapter 4 of the House Rules that were adopted on the House floor and any applicable rules adopted by the Appropriations Committee. Well, good morning. We have a general presentation on the school aid budget and MDE this morning that'll be handled by Jacqueline Mullen and Noel Benson. And with that, Jacqueline, go ahead.
Good morning. Jacqueline Mullen, Senior Fiscal Analyst for House Fiscal with my colleague Noel Benson, Fiscal Analyst at House Fiscal, and we both work on the school aid budget. We'll have the pleasure probably from hearing from Noel on MDE at a later date. She also does the MDE budget and works with her colleague, our colleague rather, Perry Zelak on the MILE budget as well. It's lovely to be here for the inaugural meeting this session. We'll start by just covering the basics. This is sort of a pared down presentation of our budget briefing. That is about twice as many slides, and it's on our website. And we'd be happy also to sit down with you and walk through it at any point if you'd like to go a little more into the weeds.
Good morning, representatives. So the school aid budget pays for the operations of public schools to maintain the K-12 and secondary education system in the state of Michigan as required by the Michigan Constitution. The school aid budget makes appropriations to 537 local school districts, 286 public school academies, and 56 intermediate districts for the operations as well as certain categorical programs, and provides funds to the Department of Education, the Department of Lifelong Education Advancement and Potential, also known as MILEP, as well as the Center for Educational Performance and Information, also known as CEPI, and other nonprofit third-party entities as needed. So there are three general types of school districts. You have traditional local school districts, which have defined boundaries, locally elected school boards, and are authorized to levy taxes. There are currently 537 of these, and that represents 89% of statewide pupil membership. There are also public school academies, also known as charter schools, which are independent schools that provide an alternative to traditional local districts. They have to be authorized to operate by public universities, community colleges, ISDs, or local school districts. And there are currently 286 of them, which represents about 11% of statewide pupil membership. Finally, we have cyber schools, which are a specific type of public school academy. There are currently 16 cyber schools operating in the state with a total of enrollment of around 21,872. And there is a current cap under 2012 PA 129, which caps all cyber school enrollment at 30,870 pupils. And finally, on this slide, you can see that over the last 20 to 30 years, there has been significant declining enrollment in schools in the state. Going into the 25 fiscal year, we're expecting about 1.38 million total students, with that expected to decline to 1.37 in FY26 and 1.36 in FY27.
So now we'll get into the school aid budget more specifically. This slide looks at the total statewide budget, and school aid is number 2. We always like to say if you take out federal funding, school aid is number 1. DHHS has a lot of federal funding in their budget, and so in a way we are number 1. School aid is about 26% at $20.8 billion. And this looks at the fund sources for the school aid budget. We are 89% funded with state restricted funding. Most of this is school aid fund or sub-accounts of the school aid fund, which is restricted on how it can be spent to schools, ISDs, community colleges, higher ed, and the MIPSR system. We also are 11% funded with federal funding. A lot of that is school meals, special education, and then Title I and other specific grants like that. And then we have technically 0% because it rounds down, 78.8 million general fund. And that funds items in our budget that are not eligible for school aid funding. So if we send money to a nonprofit or a for-profit organization that's not, the money isn't going directly to a school, that has to be general fund. If we're sending money to CEPI or MDE, that has to be general fund. Slide 7 shows how that money is being spent. So the previous slide was our revenue sources, and this is the appropriation side. About 49% of our budget supports foundation allowances. That's the general operations funding for schools. And so it's not as restricted as other categorical items are in how that money can be spent. And that's about $10.2 billion. Our next biggest appropriation is MIPSRs. That's the Public School Employees Retirement System at 13% of appropriations, and we'll have a few slides going into all of these major appropriations in a bit. Special education is 13%. That includes state and federal funding for special education, but does not include local millages. And then all other federal spending is 8%, followed by at-risk programming, which is at 5%, about $1 billion. And then early childhood programs, which is largely GSRP, our 4-year-old preschool program. That's 3% at $678 million. And then all other programs add up to about 9%. And that would be any other what we call categoricals, so specific money for specific reasons. For example, per pupil mental health and school safety, that would be another program. Or sometimes it's something as small as $500,000 for building a CTE center, something like that. That would be, all of those programs are compiled into the last slice of this pie. And slide 8 shows the revenue sources and the expenditures on a balance sheet. The balance sheet starts with the beginning balance. That's essentially how much money is in the bank account at the beginning of the fiscal year. And then we have all of the revenue sources that we talked about: school aid fund, general fund, other restricted funds, and federal funds. And after accounting for all of that revenue, we have about $21.5 billion to spend in the current fiscal year. Expenditures, school aid fund is largely spent on the school aid budget, but as I mentioned, it's also eligible to be spent on community colleges and higher education. 100% of the community colleges budget is funded with SAF, so that's also on the balance sheet as an expenditure. And part of the higher education budget at $462 million is another expenditure. So with those three budgets combined, we're spending $21.6 billion school aid fund in the current fiscal year. So if we take the revenues minus the expenditures for the current year, that's we're technically running a structural deficit, meaning we're spending more than we expect to receive. But because of that beginning balance of over $1 billion, we're still ending in the black at about $1.0 billion. And so we're not necessarily required to be in the black for the current fiscal year, but we just have to end with, when you include the beginning balance on top of that, we have to end with a balanced budget. So that ending balance carries over into the next fiscal year. So we'll start with $1.0 billion in the bank essentially. And the second column here shows a baseline budget. So this is if we continued every program funded in the current year minus taking out the one-time items, because we don't intend or expect to continue one-time items into another fiscal year, although sometimes it certainly happens. And then accounting for cost adjustments as well. So pupil decline will save a bit of money there if we don't increase the foundation allowance. Happy to go into details on that. I just don't want to get too much into the weeds. But looking at a baseline budget, we're essentially ending the year FY26 with about $2 billion. About half of that is one-time and about half of that is ongoing. So essentially that's what we have to work with in developing the budget for FY25-26. Taking a historical look at the school aid budget over the last 15 years, the total budget has grown by about 60%. About 34% of that has been driven by retirement spending, and so we're really trying to pay down unfunded liabilities. Those liabilities will be paid off by 2038, as we'll talk about in another slide, but that is part of the reason why you see increases. Another one is increased federal funding and also just increased revenues over the past few years with the pandemic and some record revenues for the school aid fund. So now we'll go into those major topics that we covered in that pie chart of appropriations. First one is the foundation allowance. Foundation allowance can get quite complicated. I don't want to overwhelm, so we just included just a couple slides showing the historical pattern here. We used to have many foundation allowances. Now we have one basic or target foundation allowance, and then which is at $9,608, and then cyber schools receive $9,150. And then there are a few exceptions there, which we can get into on this slide. This shows all of the different ways a district can be funded through the foundation allowance. So districts are required to levy, or expected rather, to levy 18 mills on non-homestead property. That makes up their local portion of the foundation allowance. Sometimes if you're a district like Clarkston, maybe you don't have a lot of non-homestead property, or maybe you have a lot of pupils that have to share that revenue. And so the local piece might only end up giving you about $1,000 per student. The state will backfill the rest of that to reach $9,608. If you look at Fairview, pretty rural town, but they have a lot of hunting cabins and second homes in that matter, and not very many pupils. So they end up receiving quite a bit of money per pupil from the local millage, $7,732. So the state only backfills $1,876 for them. In the end, we often get questions about how much money is the state sending for the state portion. In the end, the districts still receive the same amount of money per pupil. It's just sort of a matter of how much non-homestead property do they have and how many pupils do they have, about which part is funded locally and which part is funded with the state. But in the end, they're all getting up to their foundation allowance. There are a few exceptions. Big Bay and Baldwin both are out of formula districts, and that means they receive more than their foundation allowance with their local millage, and they are allowed to keep the extra money. So they don't have to send to the state whatever is above $9,608. They get to keep that. And so Big Bay ends up receiving $11,000 per pupil, and Baldwin ends up receiving $19,908 per pupil. And they get to keep that money. The state does not send them additional money, though, because they've already reached their foundation allowance. And then there are districts called hold harmless districts, and they're essentially grandfathered in. So they were allowed to have a higher foundation allowance when Proposal A began, as long as they make up whatever money is between the $9,608 and their actual foundation allowance. They have to make all that money up with an additional millage locally. So the state is not giving them money above $9,608, but they are allowed, whereas other districts are not, to levy additional millages on homestead, and then in some cases also additional millage on non-homestead to reach their higher foundation allowance. I know that's a lot, but we're happy to answer questions about this either here or sit down with you later on. And then we just thought it would be interesting to include so this is taking off federal funding. This is only looking at state funds in the budget. 15 years ago, the foundation was over 80% of state funding in the budget. So 80% of state appropriations, not including federal, was going to the foundation allowance. Today, it's about 55%. And so there's been a trend over the last 15 years of spending more money on what we call categoricals. That can be big or small things. So that's at risk is a big one. It's over $1 billion now. Special education is another one, as we have increased funding to try to combat uncompensated special education costs. But then it's also smaller, one-time grants to districts or or contracts with organizations to provide services to districts. Okay, now we'll switch from foundation allowance to special education. This is the third largest appropriation area in the budget. It's $2.6 billion total in the current fiscal year. That's split out between $2.1 billion state dollars and $533 million in federal funding. And this is to reimburse districts and ISDs for the extra costs of educating special education students. Part of that is required by a court case. The Durant court case in 1997 requires us to reimburse a specific percentage of special education costs and special education transportation costs. Districts are required under federal law to pay 100% of special education costs. So while the state funds a portion of it, the federal funding provides a portion, and then local special education mills generate an additional $1.5 billion. It's still not enough to cover 100% of the costs that districts incur. They have to pay that money anyway, so it comes out of general education funding, essentially the foundation allowance for general education pupils. And according to MDE, the latest fiscal year we have data for is FY23. We should be able to get data for FY24 as soon as the books are closed there, but uncompensated special education costs statewide equaled about $601.5 million. So that's the amount of money that districts have to pay, but they don't receive funding from federal, state, or local sources. I skipped a bullet here about the change for paying for special education foundation allowances. I'll just mention that's been part of the trend lately to try to increase compensation, where before foundation allowances for those pupils were used toward the Durant percentages, and now they're paid separately. So districts get essentially two buckets of money now instead of overlapping. And then this slide shows appropriations in the blue graph and special education pupils, which is an FTE count, in the green line. Like I said, there has been a trend the last few years to try to decrease uncompensated costs, and so increase in appropriations. And so now we are up to $2.6 billion, and special education pupils peaked, and like Noelle said, similar trend to general education pupils. We're having declining enrollment. They declined 43% by the current fiscal year. I think that's also part of a trend of trying to reduce special education FTEs and have these kids in general education classroom more as well. So this is an FTE count, not necessarily a head count, not necessarily representative of the head count for special education. And then we have a couple of slides on the public school employees retirement system, MIPSers. Appropriations totaled $2.8 billion in the current fiscal year. In some years, you can see a couple bumps, especially in the last couple years. Those have been additional one-time payments to try to pay down unfunded liabilities. So most notably in FY23, the state paid off existing university liabilities and also provided an additional $1 billion payment toward remaining UAL. And we also have a payment of $250 million in the current fiscal year to pay down, just try to pay down a little bit more than the current schedule to try to save, that will save money in the long run. And prior to 2012-ish, the districts that participate in MIPSers were required to pay the unfunded liabilities that were accruing due to assumptions that weren't necessarily as realistic as they could have been. And so those, as the UAL was compounding, those costs became quite significant. And so the state enacted a cap of 20.96% of payroll for districts. So they pay up to that amount, and then the state pays the rest. Beginning in the next fiscal year, that cap has been reduced to 15.21%. So essentially the state will just be taking on even more of the unfunded liability payments and saving districts money. The amount of money districts save depends on how much payroll they have in MIPSers, so it does vary quite a bit by district. And this shows the projection of when those unfunded liabilities will be paid off, which is 2038. The bottom piece is the base funding from schools. The green line is other state offsets, not necessarily just UAL, but also normal cost offsets. And then at the top is the state unfunded liabilities funding. So anything above that, 20.96, and then starting in FY26, the 15.21%. And that will drop off in 2038, and we will save a couple $2 billion. So that's good news. And then this slide shows retirement liabilities. The pre-funding retiree health benefits in FY12 led to the system being over 100% funded a couple years ago. But since FY 2016, pension liabilities have increased due to revising risk assumptions and policies. So there's been a concerted effort to make the assumptions that we work with more realistic, and so that we don't end up with unexpected liabilities later on down the road. So we've lowered the assumed rate of return from 8% to 6%, moved to level dollar amortization, which essentially means we expect 0% growth in payroll, and also creating a contribution floor. Okay, moving on from MIPSers, we have at-risk. The at-risk program is currently funded at just over $1 billion. One change that was made is instead of an equal amount per economically disadvantaged student, now it is based on a sliding scale, and that scale is tied to the district's proportion of economically disadvantaged pupils. So if a district has 80% economically disadvantaged pupils, they will receive a higher payment per each of those pupils than a district that has a lower proportion. It is prorated, and so right now it is about 12.5 to 16.6% of the foundation allowance, which is about $1,200 to $1,600 per pupil. And again, that's only per economically disadvantaged pupil. So they're not paid by total pupils in the district, they're paid by just the at-risk kids in the district, which is about 50% of pupils in the state. You can see the appropriations. There have been significant investments in the last few years, and pupils have also increased. This is largely due to expanding the eligibility criteria. So it used to be just free lunch, then it was free and reduced, and then we introduced Medicaid direct enrollment, community eligibility program, and various other policies have expanded who's eligible for that, for funding for this program. And I'll finally hand it over to Noel for GSRP.
So the Great Start Readiness Program is the state's 4-year-old preschool program. Previously, there were income limits set on it that only families that received or that brought in only a certain amount of income per year were eligible for the program. In recent years, that has changed. It is now available to all families. So as you can see here on this chart, the amount of appropriate for this program has increased significantly starting in FY22 as the income cap was increased and eventually removed. You can see with that green line that the number of children served has also increased. The number did dip during the pandemic before recovering to pre-pandemic levels and has continued to grow since then, along with increases in per slot funding. And finally, we have just this quick slide on some of the other major one-time categoricals in the budget. In FY25, there are a total of 58 sections that include one-time funding totaling $1.2 billion, including $181.5 million for MIPSers employee health care reimbursement, $126.5 million for per pupil mental health and school safety, in addition to $25 million ongoing, $125 million for transportation costs, $87 million for literacy supports, $71 million for enrollment stabilization, $57 million for charter school per pupil payments, and $25 million for out of school time, in addition to $50 million ongoing. And we are happy to answer any questions that you may have, either here or later.
Thank you both for that presentation. As you can all see, it's a pretty simple budget. Some overriding comments before we get to questions from members. You see there's more money, less students. When I last chaired this committee back in 18, I believe we were at $16 billion. It's grown $1 billion a year since I've been gone in 6 years. Again, a lot of money, less students, and achievement has plummeted. So we're getting very little for the amount of money that we're putting into this. There's also a comment, there's nearly $1 billion in work projects. This is something that I think is a very much a concern of several of us in the House, and we'll be looking to see what we can do about those. Also, just wanted to mention the allowance differential, particularly between cybers and traditional schools. Even there's some differences in public charter schools. Those are things that I'd like to see backfilled. Those were something that a child is a child is a child, and the money follows that child. And I think that regardless of where they choose to go to school, that money ought to follow them at the same amount. Also, just a bit of weighted formula for at-risk. There was a bit of a misnomer over the years about not providing enough funds for at-risk kids. It was kind of sold to the public as this foundation allowance was it. But we spend an awful lot in at-risk money that is then sent to schools on the behalf of those pupils. Now, I believe that there are things that determine a kid doesn't always come to school leveled up with everybody else, so that's why you have at-risk formulas. One of the things I'm interested in exploring is a redistribution of Title I funds. I think that several have said it's still not fair, even with some of the weighted things that we've done. So that's something I think that this committee will explore as well. With that, you have questions from Vice Chair Glanville.
If I may, I have more than one. So I hear what you're saying about the more money, fewer students, achievement seems to be down. And so I have a couple of questions directly related to that. First, I'm wondering if we can get an idea of what the foundation allowance is over time adjusted for inflation, just to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples instead of, 2014, $2016 to 2025. Do we have that number? Can we get it?
We can absolutely run those numbers for you and send them to you after committee in the next couple days.
Thank you. And then another item that I noticed had to do with the hold harmless districts that the state is kicking in to push them over. So most districts, the amount is 9608 at this point, and yet we see some districts that are receiving, they have their own tax levies, and the state is giving them more. So I'm just a little bit curious about that, and if that might be an opportunity, as you said, to sort of equalize things also across districts or free up a little bit. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm just curious how that plays into the finances for schools, and if, what that looks like for those districts and for the state. And then finally on this point, I heard you, I was concerned when I saw the number of special ed students seems to have dropped. And I think you said that had to do with actually the FTEs, so you're talking about the number of special ed teachers, or?
It's the full-time equated. So a student that is considered special education might not be 100%.
Okay.
They might be 0.2 special ed, 0.8 general ed.
Okay.
We can pull the head count for you if you'd like to know the number of
Yeah, I'm trying to get a more accurate count on that, because I feel like while the number of bodies may have decreased, so to speak, FTEs, I'm wondering if the percentage has increased. And what I mean by that is I think we've all heard and are well aware of the rise in autism in our schools, and other conditions, ADHD, and those qualify students for special ed supports. And so I'm wondering if, while the FTE is down if the percentage of students, so a teacher, and then combining that with how we have mainstreamed students, which, you know, is a fine concept, right, to get all kids together in one classroom. But the result then is that a gen ed teacher, where they might have had 20, 25 kids in the past with 2 or 3 who had special needs, they might now have close to 30 kids in a classroom with, you know, full on a third, maybe 10 of those have special needs. And so I just feel like, you know, looking at that piece, when we talk about the investment we're making in our schools, again, there's an additional cost to having the aides, having the technology, you know, the training for the teachers. And if teachers and aides are primarily focused on or have to adjust their teaching to accommodate these special needs kids, we might be seeing, I wonder what the correlation is there. If we need to have smaller class sizes, you know, and I know we're in a teacher shortage, but I'm just thinking about what is the economic impact in that rise of special ed students in gen ed classrooms. Long way to get to that question.
Sure, we can absolutely pull the proportion and distribute that to the subcommittee.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a lot of concerns about this idea that, you know, we're investing more, but I don't think we're looking at what the costs have shifted. And so that's what I'm trying to get at here.
Representative Jenkins Arno.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question about charter schools and how they're funded. Sorry, that chair is right in my way. So on page 11, you have the foundation allowance history and talks about the traditional schools and cyber schools. It doesn't mention charters, so I was wondering about that. And then on page 22, you have 57 million for charter school per pupil payment and the one-time categorical. So I'm kind of wondering, they're not paid the same. They're a public school as well, but they're not paid the traditional foundation allowance like traditional schools are, or how does that work exactly?
Great question. So charter schools used to have their own foundation allowance. I can't remember exactly what year it was that the minimum sort of caught up to them, and then they were just in the minimum foundation allowance. And then now that the minimum has sort of caught up to the target, they are all at 9608, except for cyber schools. And so it's not shown on this graph. We've debated pulling it out, but we figured it's already a little bit too complicated. But I can pull the foundation allowances historically for you if you'd like. But now currently, anyone except for a cyber school or a hold-harmless district is at 9,608. And then to answer your question about the charter school per pupil payment, the foundation allowance was not increased in FY25 over the prior year. Instead, there was a significant amount of money put in to lower that MIPSers cap that I talked about. Charter schools don't participate in MIPSers as much as traditional local public schools. And so I think this was publicly stated as a way to sort of ensure they receive at least some amount of increase per pupil, with it being one time with the intention that I think in the coming year, if we increase the foundation allowance, we'll all get rolled back into the new foundation together.
I just want to add that also because that they don't receive property tax, there's no facilities funding or they don't receive the local property tax. So.
That's correct. Because they don't levy millages, the state funds 100% of the 9,608 instead of having some of it offset by local millages.
Okay, and then I just had a question about the difference between like cyber schools and traditional schools that offer virtual learning. Is that, how are traditional schools funded for those virtual students, I guess is what you call them?
I believe that traditional local school districts that may offer a cyber option are being paid on the traditional foundation allowance and not, it is only cyber schools that are fully cyber, charter schools that are fully cyber schools that receive the cyber foundation. I think it's about 14 of them.
Okay.
So if a local district has an online option, that's not included in this. They're not considered a cyber school.
They're not a cyber school, but they would get the full foundation allowance for each student?
I believe so, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay,
We can reach out to MD and ask.
Thank you.
Representative Beeson?
Thank you. Thank you for the analysis. Thanks, Chair Kelly. Sorry I was 3 minutes late today. It was my birthday. I'm so excited. I had to do my, I had to cook this morning for a bunch of people, but I'm so excited that you're the chair here, sir, because you actually get to do something that we don't get to do. You've taken a break and you've came back and you were promised all the stuff and what was going to happen and how our state was going to go. And I have a sister that teaches GSRP up north, and I have a sister that teaches academic kids in your grade, and we are failing our kids. And it's great to see somebody come back and say, hold accountability. And we do it with our kids, we do it with our businesses, and we need to do it at the state level with this. And I'm glad that you guys are here. So if we can figure out ways to make it so these schools can bring our kids up, so my kids in high school have a chance to be successful instead of being in the bottom, what are we, 7 from the bottom, 8 from the bottom? And he's been promised this for a lot of years. He was promised why you were here, just like they promised to us why we're here for the short period of time, and he gets to come back and do something about it. So I'm excited to see all the passion to going into school this year. So thank you very much.
Representative Stekeloff?
All right, Rep. Beeston, I'm going to try and keep up with your energy. Happy birthday. I do have a few questions, if you don't mind. Number one of the concerns I think a lot of us are going to have is with the school's fiscal year. While we have, a law into place for July 30th, the constitutional deadline is in September, and we keep hearing that that's probably the deadline that the speaker is looking at going towards. How is this going to affect? I know it affects a few different, budgets, but do you know how this is going to affect the schools? I know we've been in this situation before. I know there was like almost a shutdown about 2 decades ago. How did we back then work and figure that out, or was it up to each individual school district?
That's correct, Representative. The school fiscal year does not match up with the state fiscal year. So school fiscal year starts July 1st instead of October 1st. And so recently, the last decade or so, we have passed the school aid budget by June 30th, rather. And that actually, it does help schools, but they do have to have their budget already done by that point.
Okay.
But they are able to more quickly adjust and anticipate the funding that they will receive over the next fiscal year when we pass it by July 1st. And I think that's been a stated reason why we have been pushing to pass the budget earlier the last several years. If we don't pass it by July 1st, essentially districts have to guess about what the state budget will be. And they look to the executive recommendation, the House passed budget, and the Senate passed budget, and kind of guess at where, especially for the foundation allowance, which is the main source of funding for districts. They essentially take an average or a guess, or if they're optimistic, they look at the highest one and base their funding off that, and then they just have to adjust mid-year when the budget is passed.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking they would have to do like some sort of guess. The next question is, do we know possibly, and this is like, you know what, I'm going to ask a different question first. I haven't seen anything about dual enrollment. Do you know how much we typically spend on dual enrollment and how many students participate?
So my understanding is that dual enrollment, each individual district pays for that out of a student's foundation allowance. It is not something that we keep track of at the state level. That being said, for non-public students, we do have $3.5 million currently appropriated in the MyLeap budget for non-public students to do dual enrollment. As far as that goes for charter schools or traditional public schools, that's entirely determined at the district level.
I know we're really focusing on like career and tech, trying to push a lot of students towards that, and I know dual enrollment has really helped. So if there's any chance we have somewhat of an idea of numbers about that, I would love to see that if at all available. I don't know if MyLeap might have that information.
I will see if I can find anything out for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And my one last question, which is going to be a tough one. Just in case, I know we're assuming it's not going to happen, but just in case the Department of Education is no longer a thing, do we know what programs predominantly that funding goes towards and what the cost we would be losing or how much we would be losing? I think it's the at-risk.
Yes, I have Noel pull up the amount of federal funding in the budget. I will say, I think even if the federal Department of Education is abolished, I've heard from news articles that some of that funding might be filtered through other departments. So I'm not 100% sure if that would cut all federal funding to the state for education purposes. But would you like to go through it?
I can go through it, yes. So in total, we have about just under 2.3 billion in federal funding in the budget.
That's what I thought it was. Okay.
Looking at a few of the big line items, we have 916 million for school lunch programs, 535 million for Title I for disadvantaged students, 450 million for special education, an additional 55 million for other special education grants, and the rest of that is distributed throughout different grants in smaller amounts. We can send you this full list of programs if you would like.
Yeah, so it's about 2.3 billion.
Yes.
Okay. It's not as bad as I thought. Thank you.
Also, just want to remind you that on the special ed, that the federal coffers have never come up to what they've said that they promised. So that's always something that we need to work on. Representative Beeson, please.
Didn't we, just out of curiosity, I'm pretty sure 2 years ago, we put money in the school aid fund for the low-interest loans for schools to grab a hold of before their budgets. Did we take that out 2 years ago? It was for people that, in case we didn't get their funds, they could use the money, or do we not have that in there anymore? I think we did like 30 million or low-interest loans for the gap between when we decide when the budget is and what they actually have to make. Is that still in the budget?
We do have funding so the school aid fund as a revenue source has to borrow money because of a fluke on revenue collection and expenditures. But that's on the revenue side. I'm not aware of an expenditure side.
Okay.
So we have to pay interest costs essentially to the general fund for borrowing. But I'm not aware of a categorical that goes out to districts as a low interest
I thought, well, I've been off for 2 years, so I'm trying to figure, or it's been changed. The other thing is your gross appropriations for your federal programs, we give out 1.7, right? And then our other programs is 1.9, which is, if we have to lose it, we have somewhere in our budget to offset it right now, or no, for the federal money? I mean,
That
looking
would
at
be-
this, if I'm the person making the budget, I'm looking at this saying, we have it in there in case that happens. That's what I'm curious to say.
We also have a rainy day fund for school aid, but that has specific criteria on when we can spend it. I would say as far as using other programs to pay for federal programs, that would be up to the discretion of you all.
Okay, but it's
I'm not
there.
sure I can weigh in on the benefits
it's
or
there. Thank you.
drawbacks of that.
Representative Glanville.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to follow up a little bit on the deadline for the budget. I heard Rep. Beeson talk about accountability and schools being able to demonstrate the return on investment, things like that. And so I just want to point out, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, schools have to submit their budget by a certain time to the state. And if their budget is off by a certain percentage, they get kicked into Treasury, where they start an investigation on whether they should, like if they're operating at a loss. And I'm not 100% clear on the terms here, but does this ring a bell? Can you expand on that a little bit?
I will say I'm not an expert on the school side of things. I do know that there are partnership districts where the state is in a partnership with the districts to increase their financial situation and student achievement, and they are monitored. We receive quarterly reports, but I'm not sure about the specifics of how that works. That might be a question for our friends at MDE.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear how schools have to, like what happens when they miss their budget targets or when their budget isn't in line with, I guess it's their budget target. And then the other piece I just want to say again, pointing the importance of passing this budget by June 30th, is that, again, when we talk about accountability, there's no business, there's no organization in the world that begins their fiscal year without knowing what their income and expenses are going to be, their revenues and their expenses. And then 3 months into their fiscal year, that all changes. So we continually ask our schools, and we have done this, whether it happens, actually happens, or if it just is this sort of roaming threat, if you will. They have to prepare for a school year. They don't know how many staff they can have. They don't know what programs they're going to be able to pay for. It's all a big question mark going into, that fiscal year. And they come up, July 1st, either breathing a sigh of relief or sending out pink slips. And so again, when we talk about like the accountability of our schools, the ability of our schools to deliver quality education, this constant, back and forth on the funding, I feel like that is an issue that we need to really just be straightforward on as legislators. It's our responsibility to make sure that our public services are funded on time. So I would ask my colleagues and the chair to consider that as we are working towards this. I know with the federal budget up in the air and everything else, certainly there are some GF funds that might be an impact on this budget, but I think we can do something to get money out to our schools and a budget out to our schools on time so that they can continue to prepare and function best for our students and families. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's certainly been my practice as my first tour of chairing this, that we always had the budget out on time. I think since I've been gone, the budget's been out on time, certainly in the school. So I don't, and I anticipate this budget being on time. Whether or not the general budget it will be, that's another story. But I'm certainly going to be focused on trying to get this out on time. Any other questions? If not, I want to thank you again for your presentation. I know this has been brief, and we'll get into a little more detail as the weeks follow. But with that being said, there being no further business, the meeting is adjourned.